I'm Ari Redbord, and this is TRM Talks. I am Global Head of Policy at TRM Labs. At TRM, we provide blockchain intelligence software to support law enforcement investigations and to help financial institutions and cryptocurrency businesses mitigate financial crime risk within the emerging digital asset economy. Prior to joining TRM, I spent 15 years in the U.S. federal government, first as a prosecutor at the Department of Justice, and then as a Treasury Department official, where I worked to safeguard the financial system against terrorist financiers, weapons of mass destruction proliferators, drug kingpins, and other rogue actors. On TRM Talks, I sit down with business leaders, policymakers, investigators, and friends from across the crypto ecosystem who are working to build a safer financial system. On today's TRM Talks, I sit down with Coinbase's Tom Duff Gordon. But first, inside the lab, where I share data-driven insights from our blockchain intelligence team. On today's Inside the Lab, we unpack TRM's take on the Wolfberg Group's new guidance for providing banking services to stablecoin issuers. Our colleagues, Tom Armstrong and Luke Dufour, do a great job breaking this down. Check out their video on our website at trmlabs.com/resources. The guidance clarifies that banks must treat stablecoin relationships just like any other bank-to-bank link, whether it's operating, reserve, or settlement accounts. The same financial crime risk principles apply. The guidance emphasizes that oversight should lean on the issuer's declared risk appetite, with proportional on-chain and off-chain monitoring layered in. Blockchain intelligence isn't about chasing every token hop. It's about verifying that behavior matches expectation and surfacing anomalies. Very important guidance from a standard setter. For TRM, this is a signal. Stablecoin-linked banking must build in visibility from day one. The tools, workflows, and analytics we provide help financial institutions align with those expectations, managing innovation without sacrificing compliance. For more, check out Tom and Luke's video. Now, I sit down with Tom Duff Gordon. Tom, thank you so much for joining us. I feel like you and I have spent time literally all over the world together, running in Singapore and dinners with policymakers. So thank you for actually spending a little one-on-one time with me today to hopefully have a really fun conversation.
It's a delight to be here, Ari, with you. And whether we're in Brussels or in Singapore, love chatting and catching up with you. I think the work that you guys are doing at TRM is epic and incredibly valuable. So it's a privilege to be with you and look forward to the discussion.
I would love to start, eventually I think we're going to talk about really what you've built with an amazing policy team at Coinbase. But I'd love to hear sort of how you ended up in this really unique role.
Yeah, happy to. I was in TradFi, so I was at Credit Suisse, so now UBS, but I was there for 15 plus years, and I joined actually in 2006. So this was the time where, if you remember, it was very frothy. This was kind of like the bull market, and I joined as a young analyst in the investment banking strategy team. So all of those stories about, investment banking analysts working long hours, getting the late taxi home and then starting the next day. So I'd certainly had a little bit of that experience, but I do also remember just a year into the job, the failure of some of those Bear Stearns hedge funds. Do you remember in June of 2007? And that was the first kind of glimpse of, the global financial crisis or something bad is about to happen. And then I just had this kind of incredible ringside seat through the re-regulation of kind of banks through that kind of, decade kind of period. But when I started, I was in the strategy team and the investment bank, which gave me an insight across different parts of the investment bank, which was really valuable. But when the crisis hit, obviously, everything was not about building new businesses and, M&A and those types of things, but more about how do we streamline, how do we get rid of people? So less fun from my perspective. And it just occurred to me that where strategy was really going to happen was in the policy team. The funny thing is that policy wasn't a thing then in investment banks. There were 2 or 3 people who did it. And I think Credit Suisse wasn't alone in having a few folks, but they were not really front and center. But guess what? When regulation is changing and the rule books are being torn up and put back together again, suddenly, in those periods, policy becomes a very strategic function. And so I thought, do you know what? I'm just going to try and walk across the floor and knock on this person's door and see whether they'll take me. And I was super lucky, and they did take me, and it turned out to be a good move. And, we then spent the next decade, as I said, trying to re-regulate and make banks a little bit stronger and more resilient. And Credit Suisse actually invented one of the core concepts, which has become global law in terms of bank recovery and resolution, which is around bail-in. So this concept that banks shouldn't be bailed out by the state, but they should be kind of bailed in by using their own balance sheet. And I was kind of the junior person working with our ex-chief risk officer, a fantastic guy who was a mentor called Wilson Irvin. And we took this idea, which was his idea, and we tried to sell it kind of globally. And we were incredibly unpopular, Ari, like in the first few kind of months of this, because obviously this was an expensive and unpopular thing to do. But then it became kind of accepted, and, we were excited. And that whole process of developing a new kind of rule book and a big idea, selling it and thinking that this is actually contributing to something bigger than just us and our business was something that I really enjoyed doing. And then I had the good fortune to go on and lead that team and run the Europe, Middle East, and Africa policy team at Credit Suisse. Had a bunch of really exciting kind of experiences because we've had a lot of crises between now and then, global financial crisis, but then Brexit and COVID and Ukraine and the sovereign debt crisis, etc. And so working at a bank during that period was with a ringside seat to some of those things was incredibly kind of like a rich experience.
It's amazing. But before I dig into your current role and sort of how you ended up at Coinbase, did those experiences in your early days of banking sort of lead to a feeling of there's got to be a better way? I think sort of a lot of the advocacy that you do at Coinbase today, right? I mean, you lived through the financial crisis where banks in large part failed their customers in the global financial system. What role has that experience played in sort of your current role?
Yeah, I love that question because I do sometimes remember that the Genius block in kind of Bitcoin, had that excerpt with the Financial Times and the kind of the headline around the banks being bailed out. And then I think I spent so long trying to kind of work with others on how to avoid that ever happening again and how to create a better system. And then to your point, had to become quite familiar with post-trade, so i.e. how capital markets and the plumbing of them really work and all of the different actors involved and, the complexity of derivatives portfolios and what happens when that goes wrong and a kind of a web of intermediaries. And for sure, when I started learning and thinking about crypto, which is kind of peer-to-peer and programmable and open source and transparent and traceable, all of those things resonated almost more deeply and more personally with me because of all of that experience that I'd had exactly as you suggest.
Really extraordinary. So why did you do this crazy thing? You had a great career going in financial services, policy, you'd found this really cool role. What was it about crypto, Coinbase in particular, that caused you to sort of make this move?
Well, I'd become a bit of a generalist, which was a kind of a good thing in some senses, but there's a little bit of me which is quite nerdy and I like going deep on things. And after a while, I realized that the two big things happening in finance were kind of green finance and digital finance. And I had a team member who was looking at MiCA, and I was getting increasingly interested in it. And actually, at the same time, I was reading the book, The 100-Year Life by Linda Gratton. It's super interesting. Kind of says, look, in the old days, you used to be able to go to college, take one job, and then retire. And that was kind of it. But now, like with life expectancy so much kind of longer, and if you want to live a healthy, kind of active life a bit longer, from a kind of cognitive and health perspective, you've got to change it up from time to time. And so that was kind of, in the back of my mind. And then I got a phone call from actually someone who works in my team now at Coinbase saying, Tom, why aren't you responding to these headhunters? And I had COVID at the time, but because of that, I went really deep on crypto. I'd been at kind of surface level and been kind of tinkering a bit, but then I went really deep into it for some of the reasons that we've just discussed, but also because of the opportunity for policy to play such a strategic role in getting this industry off the ground. I felt like this was just a superb challenge. And then Coinbase with a mission, I'm sure everyone talks about this, but economic freedom, Brian's vision, and those types of things, and the caliber of people at Coinbase that I started to meet just convinced me that this was the job I could not take up. So those are the reasons.
You mentioned sort of going deep, right? When you were sort of looking at Coinbase, having those conversations, eventually getting there. I do get asked all the time, like, how do you do that, right? What were some of the things that you did as you were either interviewing or as you sort of got there?
Yeah, well, I have a bit of a barbell strategy. So the first thing is honestly, and I'm not sure I prescribe this to anybody, so it comes with a user warning, but I did go into YouTube was my kind of first thing, and just a ton of videos that were super interesting, very accessible on YouTube. Kind of a lot of the actors and presenters made, super articulate, made it very accessible to me. But then I did the barbell and went down to the local bookshop and bought some of the kind of the big academic treaties. So it was a mixture of doing those two things. And then I think for everybody, it's a bit like if you go to the horse races, it's no fun unless you've got a bet on. I think you've got to open an account and you've got to dive in and do stuff. And that's really interesting because you and I talk a lot to policymakers and regulators. And I do sometimes wonder to what extent they are allowed or do engage in some of the things that they're thinking and regulating, because there's no real substitute for understanding this from actually getting your hands kind of dirty.
It's something that's just a consistent cry from, I think, folks in the industry to policymakers and regulators globally. And we've talked about this so much on TRM talks over the years. I think in the US for years, it's even been banned. Engaging with the technology essentially has been banned by US federal government employees, which is crazy. Talk a little bit about how the role was when you first got there, and then how the policy role at Coinbase has grown and developed over the years.
Yeah. So I look after something called international policy. So that's what we kind of do outside of the US. So we have a fantastic kind of team and operation in the US, and Faryal Shahzad is our chief policy officer. My role is looking at everything outside. And obviously our biggest sphere of kind of operations right now is Europe, but we have activities across Asia, Latin America, kind of North America, and now the Middle East. So that's the job. That's what I do. My average day, it's interesting. I will tell you, there has not been in the 3.5 years I've been at Coinbase 2 weeks where I've had the same work pattern, much to my kind of family and wife's dismay, I have to tell you. But it's such fun, and it's so dynamic and different because, we may talk a bit about this later, but multiple jurisdictions and countries are all on their journey towards figuring out what to do with crypto policy, like how much to lean into it. And we know what all the steps are. Different regions are at different phases of that progression. And, we want to be involved and engaged in as many of those discussions as possible. So I tend to kind of start with Asia in the morning, and I've got an amazing team in Singapore that cover that region. And then the classic thing is I kind of follow the sun and end up doing a bunch of kind of meetings in London and Europe, and a long day normally with kind of San Francisco kind of internal calls, but a huge amount of traveling, which is a real privilege, tiring, but a real privilege. And I get out and meet face to face with as many policymakers as I can to talk about crypto, to talk about the contribution that we think the industry can make to promoting economic freedom. And, as I said, no 2 weeks the same. So we haven't settled into a pattern yet, but I think that is a reflection of just how dynamic and fast evolving the sector is.
I think, honestly, one of the reasons I'm just such a fan of you personally and professionally is just that. I explain to people sometimes, like, I've never worked harder and I've never had more fun. And as long as I can kind of keep that dynamic in some sort of balance and my marriage intact, like, we're all winners. And to think about just the space that you cover, right? This idea of international being everything but the US is crazy. What does policy mean to you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the simplest way of framing it is what I want to be engaged in and what the team to be engaged in is the development of pro-crypto policy and regulatory frameworks kind of throughout the world. So we don't get engaged in day-to-day supervision. So the relationship that our firm has with the regulators, for example, on a day-to-day basis, that is a compliance and legal-driven kind of activity and topic. But from first principles, how do we regulate this industry? Is crypto different from financial services and financial products that we currently know and understand? How do we protect consumers when they need protecting? How do we make sure that this doesn't disrupt financial stability, impact market integrity, etc.? But equally, how do we think about promoting an environment for innovation to drive growth and jobs if we think that blockchains are a better kind of mechanism for value transfer than the current system? And I think it's so interesting to note the evolution in the conversations that I'm having. I joined in 2022, so we then went through the 2 years of kind of crypto winter, the very difficult FTX collapse, the Terra Luna, etc. And, that was really hard. And, it was the actors in the industry that were trying to be compliant first and try and do things the right way had historically been moving slower than some of the other actors. I'm really hoping we've come out of that now. And it does feel like the conversations are less around, does it work? And is it all just full of kind of like scammers, to actually a recognition. I think most people would agree with the premise that crypto is either part of the future of the financial system or is the future of the financial system, right? And so I think we are now starting the conversation in a different and more positive place. But policy for me is all about trying to fix difficult problems. And policy is all about trade-offs. Like politics is not easy, right? There's no quick and simple answer to any of this stuff. There's all sorts of trade-offs and it can be very technical. But the fun part of it is trying to be a little bit the translator between what our product folks want to do in terms of building these amazing new products and services they want to unleash into the environment and, try and extrapolate from that what the public policy benefits and also disbenefits are, and to think about how would you kind of address those in a structured conversation with policymakers. So it's huge fun actually to be involved in that, and so much more innovation in this job than in some of my previous jobs, because we have, whole new actors, whole new products and services, new questions being asked the whole time. And it's very disruptive. And when you disrupt the status quo, then, that also creates, really interesting, knotty public policy kind of questions to grapple with.
Yeah, it's amazing. I think that you, in particular, Coinbase, has not just created a lot of that narrative around sort of crypto is here to stay, but you also in large part have reinvented what policy means in some respects. Let me give you an example. I was in a meeting this week with a policymaker on Capitol Hill, and they asked me a question that I have no business answering. But it was something around, why do you think the larger players in the space are always out advocating for more nascent, let's say, decentralized finance players, early stage protocols, developers, builders? And my answer was something around, look, we're all early stage still, like this entire industry. So I think there's a lot of camaraderie there, but it's also around ideology, right? But I would love to hear your answer to that, because I think Coinbase, oftentimes people say, wow, it's crazy that Coinbase is out there advocating for DeFi. Talk me through that.
Yeah, happy to. I think a lot of this comes down from the top. I mean, Brian is just fantastic on this topic. I mean, I think his view is that Coinbase will continue to evolve and that DeFi is a big part of the future. And if that means that we have to, decentralize ourselves and our products and services, then we will and we should. And so I think he sets the tone and we follow. I love what you were saying, because we take the small companies and the DeFi protocols and stuff round to meet policymakers, not just in the US, but also kind of through Stand With Crypto and other platforms throughout the rest of the world. And do you know what, Ari, honestly, like much as I think, well, obviously you do a stellar job and we think we do an okay job, the best advocates, the most powerful advocates for this industry, I think, are sometimes the practitioners and like the builders and the developers who've identified a problem, figured out a new way of kind of answering that and delivering a solution, but find barriers to their ability to be able to scale that or raise finance, or there's a regulatory issue or the compliance is too expensive. And, you see the policymaker kind of like nodding and taking notes in a really powerful way when they see that, because ultimately this is about driving jobs and growth and, SMEs. And if we can find better rails, better financial services, cheaper finance, quicker, faster finance, and do that for the broader economy, I think that's what we all get out of bed for. And, bringing those folks to explain that can be so interesting and powerful. There's a coffee shop in DC that pays for the coffee beans from El Salvador and Bitcoin, and the way that they've disintermediated the supply chain, saved a ton of money, pay the farmers quicker and better. And, it's just a small story, but these anecdotes, I think, can be really powerful.
I love that so much. You mentioned coffee in DC. I know that my favorite coffee place in DC is Compass, which has a bunch of different locations around town. And I know that Stand With Crypto has worked with Compass on USDC payments through your Coinbase account to buy coffee. I think I see behind you a can. Is it a soda can?
Yeah.
What is Stand With Crypto? And what is that can?
I love it that you see the can. That was good product placement. We were just in Liverpool, which is a town in the northwest of the UK this week, where they had the Labour Party conference, and Stand With Crypto came along. Stand With Crypto is a grassroots crypto advocacy body that Coinbase is effectively, we're big, strong backers of it, but we have tons of partners, and we want Stand With Crypto to basically talk for the industry, not just for Coinbase. But the idea and the philosophy behind it, again, driven a lot by Brian and his view that advocacy can be done at a number of different levels. You can do it at the corporate level, and you can engage in very formal kind of meetings on the Hill or in Westminster or in Brussels or in Singapore or wherever you happen to be. But there's a really powerful form of advocacy around building the base, energizing the base. And people who use crypto, who tend, to skew demographically young, they tend to care about the technology, see the real potential for it. And we've just found it so powerful to bring that community together under this banner called Stand With Crypto. And in the UK, for example, we just love shining a spotlight on the entrepreneurs, the developers, the builders in the space who are just doing cool things up and down the country, and then using that as a platform to bring to policymakers to say, when you think as a policymaker, why should I care about prioritizing or promoting this industry through either regulation or legislation? I care because I can give you 4 examples of genuine kind of real economic activity, which has been done better and more competitively using this technology. So that's what Stand With Crypto is. And I think Stand With Crypto has been actually really powerful in showing that there is a crypto voter and showing the salience of this issue. And the success we've had in the US with it is really helping to put a bit of a spotlight and some attention on some of the initiatives we're doing internationally with it.
It's truly extraordinary. I moderated a panel with Faryar, who you mentioned several months ago, and I asked around this question of like, hey, policy means different things to different people. To you, over the last year or so, it's been building a crypto army, essentially, to show policymakers globally that this crypto voter does in fact exist. That is very different than a lot of the probably one-on-one policy engagement that maybe you're used to having done previously in your career and even in the early days of Coinbase. I mean, this is a very different type of policy role. Let's get a little nuts and bolts. So like we've talked about, I think, the role and what you do and Stand With Crypto. Talk me through sort of where you're excited about what's happening. I feel like the UK and Europe is an interesting moment, slightly different. APAC is always accelerating, it feels like, in this space. Talk me through, though, what you're seeing on the ground and the impact that you're having.
Yeah, happy to. As I said before, I had to kind of zoom out, and I feel like the journey is, stage one for most countries is they normally think about AML and taxation. It's kind of, that's the first, if you're going to do something, you do something in those spaces. And then the next big step is, what do we do around kind of centralized actors and platforms, CASPs or VASPs as we call them. And then stable coins tends to be part of that second step. And then the third one is DeFi and tokenization, et cetera. So it feels like that's the journey. And what has happened in the US recently, like the passing of Genius, but even before that with the kind of Project Crypto and those types of things, has led to, I think, just generally a perspective that I see across multiple jurisdictions, whereby if there was already a crypto framework in place, then there's suddenly a new desire to kind of just go up a gear and put your foot on the gas and try and make the most of that advantage. But what it's really done is focus the minds of some of those jurisdictions where there kind of wasn't something, or they were just cycling through kind of analysis and kind of not getting around to it. So there's a real acceleration that's happening now. And a lot of that has to do with developments in the US. It also has to do, I think, with institutional adoption, which has been really powerful and grown really steadily. But just between now and the end of this year, we're going to have a lot of things happening. So in Canada, we're hoping to get something on stablecoins in the budget. And I think that would be kind of welcome, a long time coming. In Australia, we're hoping to get something on stablecoins. We've just had their CAS regime drop, so that's good. Singapore, again, on stablecoins. Switzerland, stablecoins and CAS rules. The UK on stablecoins. The EU at the end of this year on DLT pilot regime and tokenization. Middle East is always doing lots of interesting stuff. So it's kind of an ongoing kind of like cycle, and everybody's moving forward. But it does feel like the theme a bit at the moment is stablecoins and tokenization. And, particularly in the UK and the EU, we're beginning to kind of dive quite deep into those areas.
Policymakers in the EU, France, and some other countries a couple of weeks ago said, hey, look, we're working on MiCA implementation, but it's harder than expected, which I think you and I and other folks knew this was going to be hard when you have 37 member states with completely different political systems and resources and all the problems that Europe has always had with the EU. But tell me where you feel like things are right now, just given sort of your closeness to the situation in Europe.
Yeah, it's a great question. And that, just to kind of start out, I will say that Coinbase, we've always been positive about MiCA because the EU did move very early. I mean, as you said, with 27 member states, to get anything done takes 4 years. So they started this 2018, 2017.
And you were very early in being MiCA compliant and getting your license and working through all those issues. So it's very cool.
Yeah, we're MiCA licensed in Luxembourg, and so we're delighted about that. But it opens up this market of 500 million kind of people and provides regulatory clarity, which is great. But as you say, there are always questions around how does it get implemented. MiCA said that national competent authorities, so each of the supervisors in the 27 member states, have responsibility for the actors in their jurisdiction, but they can passport across, the whole of the region, rather than having a kind of a single centralized supervisory authority. And I think, there were some papers out recently, and Europe is beginning to question whether that was the right decision to kind of decentralize supervision or not. Look, I mean, that's going to be a tricky question, be a very political question, and we'll see how that plays out. I mean, for us, to be honest, the kind of knotty technical questions now that we see in Europe revolve a bit more around stablecoins, tokenization, and kind of payment services. On stablecoins, there's a big question around multi-issuance. So we have US dollar stablecoins, which are 99% of the market, but a few of them, or at least USDC, is regulated in both the US and in the EU. There's a question about how do we make sure that we can have fungibility across the two regions. And as you and I know, stablecoins, one of their biggest value drivers and factors is cross-border, right? I mean, that's what they're designed for. That's what they do best. They do lots of good things, but cutting out that system of kind of cross-border correspondent banks and the peer-to-peer cross-border is a big value prop for stablecoins. And so I think working through how to make sure that you don't have a disbalance or an unbalanced reserve framework versus circulating currency in either jurisdiction, making sure that Genius and the EU rules can talk to each other, having rebalancing mechanisms, having transparency. I think that's really important that Europe figures that out, because I think what we're all trying to avoid is that we have this great breakthrough on cross-border payments, and then we find ourselves not able to fulfill that promise by effectively duplicating and asking for kind of issuance to be fragmented across different regimes and lacking in interoperability or fungibility between them. So I think that's a big topic in Europe. The other one we're excited about, and we think they're well positioned, is on tokenization. They have the DLT pilot regime. I think the Commission in particular recognizes, the power of tokenization, not just for cash like stablecoins, but real world assets. So, funds and ultimately debt instruments and equity instruments. And, how to update the DLT pilot regime that they have in the EU in order to try and bootstrap tokenization in Europe, I think is a very current question that they have right now. And how to make sure that Europe can keep pace with the US. I think what the US is doing on tokenization is incredibly ambitious and very leapfrogging. And I think the UK, the EU, and other financial centers around the world, should be figuring out, I think are figuring out how to track some of those developments as we think about doing amazing things like moving gigantic portions potentially over time of our capital markets, off traditional rails and putting them on chain. It's like a really exciting but really complicated proposition.
Incredible answer. Let's talk really quick about teams. I have an amazing team that I'm super proud of, people like Isabella Chase and Angela Ong. But honestly, when I look around the space, you just have this really extraordinary team, not just of true subject matter experts, but really, really cool, nice, humble people. How do you build a team like that?
Well, thank you for asking that. And I think that the way you are so effusive and complimentary about your team is such a lesson for all of us in management. And I see you do that really publicly, and I love that. But yes, I'm very lucky. We have an incredible team here that we've kind of built. And it's a mixture of kind of athletes who are not just technically extremely competent, but also very good at the kind of the people side and the networking, because you need that kind of mixture in our world, right? Of knowing who to talk to and when, but equally being able to be substantive and try and kind of dig into the argument. And Katie Harry's in Europe. I have Roland in Brussels, Katie Mitchell, and David Menz in Singapore. I want to almost give them all a big shout out because they're
absolutely should. And they're all amazing people that I have gotten to know personally and professionally over the years. It's really extraordinary. And it's not easy. And they've all been with you and together for a really long time now, which is, I think, pretty amazing and speaks a lot to your leadership.
Well, I hope it stays like that. And Adi Kalkani, I can't forget that. Otherwise, they won't stick together if I don't mention it. But no, it's an extraordinary set of individuals. And I will say across the US team and under fire as well, we see the incredible work that they're doing in the US. And that galvanizes us to match and try and do more on the international side. But it comes down to also a set of people who want to advocate not just for the firm, but for the broader industry and for something kind of bigger than just who we are at Coinbase. And I think that mission that we have, which is just a bigger one, that motivates people a lot and gets people out of bed. And I like to just give teams leadership and runway to do things. There's such a big space. There's so many problems to be addressed here. I'm just delighted to have a group of folks who really want to dig in and really want to take some ownership and really kind of push ahead.
It's awesome. I've learned so much from what you guys have done. On that note, last question here. You are traveling constantly, really all over the world, and it makes so much sense given your remit. What do you do to sort of like relax a little bit?
Well, I definitely pack my running shoes. I think, if you do as much traveling as I do, you have to do that. I've yet to find a compact, squashable set of running shoes that you can kind of get into the suitcase. So I would love your tips, but it's the best way of beating jet lag. And I'm lucky. I don't get jet lag very much. My wife is always kind of amazed, like, why aren't you asleep the whole weekend? But I seem to be okay. And one of the reasons is by getting out and doing some running. So I run. The other thing I love is tennis, which is just like a huge sport that I'm big into. And my kids we can now rally together as a family and stuff like that, which is just super fun. And then the third thing is I'm a complete wannabe DJ.
Oh, amazing.
I'm at that very sad stage of at a party wanting to be the guy who's choosing the music on Spotify, but I need to upgrade that into kind of decks and all of that stuff. My wife bought me a course to learn DJing, but I haven't had the time to do it. But that's on my bucket list to
Oh
do.
my goodness. I love this. It's my favorite question to ask in these things. And I get, you really learn so much about folks. You know, what's so funny is now I check a bag almost everywhere I go because I bring like 50 hats with me for the TRM Run Club. So I'm always now like, people think somehow marketing teams get these things placed. Like, come on. So yeah, I'm almost always, so I can take all the shoes I need, which I quite frankly always do have a lot of shoes. Best city run in one of your travels from your policy role, or like favorite runs?
Good question. I think in Washington, depending on where you're staying, if you're in Georgetown and you can run up the river, which I've done a few times from there, like I was just like, that was just so beautiful. I love doing that. Running in Singapore, just round the bay with Marina Bay Sands kind of in the background is
almost always hot, but amazing. Yes, that's a great one.
Melbourne, again, up the river and then through the Botanic Garden, the tan, as they call it down there. That's been a highlight. But yeah, I mean, you and I should riff on this, actually. We should maybe have a kind of a book of best runs.
It's ironic. My favorite run in the world is in DC, but I love running in London, which is so interesting that you didn't say that, right? I love running along the Thames. I love running up through Buckingham Palace, through the park. I mean, it's just, there's so much you can see. And honestly, for me, a lot of it is tourism, right? Like, it's the way I see stuff, especially when you're locked in meetings and some conference or something. It's like the 1 hour you have maybe in a day or two, right, to do this stuff. So it's awesome. Well, I'm excited to run with you many more places in the world. Tom, thank you so much for joining TRM Talks. Really, just keep up the great work. It's so fun to watch you do your thing out there.
I love partnering with you guys at TRM. So yeah, same to you. And this was fun. Thank you for having me.
It's so interesting. I was invited on to a friend's podcast recently, Caroline Malcolm, and Caroline asked me a lot of questions. The whole idea of the podcast was, what is policy? And the conversation I loved having with Tom is the way that his role and the way Coinbase's role in the broader ecosystem from a policy perspective has really evolved. And really what they've done with Stand With Crypto to really build this crypto army to go out there and advocate for a really nascent space is just so unique. And my favorite part of the conversation was he referenced the book where it talked about sort of reinventing yourself. And it's so clear that sort of TradFi to DeFi and the work that Coinbase is doing has really allowed Tom to reinvent himself, quite frankly, in a way that I really related to personally as well. You know, having been in the government for so long and then having this like really crazy fun role at TRM. So I think when I think to myself, well, what is policy? In many ways, it is Tom. It is the true subject matter expert, but also who's a leader in the space, who's built this amazing team of experts in these different key regions and out there advocating not just for Coinbase, which is just so cool, right? But for the broader ecosystem, you know, small DeFi protocols and builders and developers, and then one of the largest, most important centralized crypto businesses in the world. So, you know, what is policy? I think policy is in large part exactly what Tom Duff Gordon is doing at Coinbase. And that's why this was such a cool conversation. On the next TRM Talks, I sit down with the chief of IRS criminal investigation, Guy Fico. If you love the show, leave a review wherever you're listening to it. Follow us on LinkedIn to subscribe to our newsletter, The Weekly Roundup, to get the latest news on crypto regulation, compliance, and investigations.
TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software. This episode was produced in partnership with Vantage Productions. The music for this show was provided by Ecolix.
Now, let's get back to building.